A driver gets a strange feeling about a boy on his bus, then looks at his hand and sees it. At first, it's just a quiet kid at an empty stop, but something about him feels off. When the boy pulls up his sleeve, a glowing mark flashes, gone before the driver can fully process it. Then it happens, on his own hand. The same glowing symbol appears, pulsing with an otherworldly energy. As fear tightens its grip, the driver realizes this isn't coincidence. This boy is here for him. But why? What is the mark, and what does it mean for his fate? One thing is certain: the answers will change everything. What would you do if destiny came knocking in the form of a silent, glowing symbol? Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. Stan Holloway eased his bus around the familiar corner of Pine Street, his hands moving with the practiced grace of someone who had driven this route for 15 years. The morning sun painted the streets of Clearview in soft golden light, making the dew-kissed sidewalks shimmer. He smiled, feeling the comfortable weight of routine settle around him like a well-worn jacket. "Good morning, Mrs. Hargrove," Stan called out as the perpetually worried woman climbed aboard, her ever-present umbrella clutched tightly despite the cloudless sky. "They're saying it might rain later, Mr. Holloway," she responded, shaking her head. "Mark my words." She settled into her usual seat, arranging her purse and umbrella. Stan bit back a chuckle. Mrs. Hargrove had been predicting rain every morning for the past 3 years, rain or shine. It was just part of the familiar rhythm of his day. The next stop brought the usual group of high school students, their energy filling the bus with life. Jenny Martinez and her friends huddled in their regular spots, their animated chatter about the upcoming school dance floating forward. "I can't believe he asked Sarah instead," one girl exclaimed, while another responded with an emphatic, "I know, right?" Stan watched them in his rearview mirror, remembering his own high school days. Their drama and excitement were as much a part of his morning route as the streets themselves. At the Cedar Street stop, Mr. Collins boarded with his customary precise movements. His newspaper was folded exactly in quarters, tucked under his arm just so. He gave Stan his usual silent nod, no more, no less, before taking his seat 3 rows back on the right side. Stan could set his watch by Mr. Collins's routine. The bus hummed along its route, a mechanical ballet Stan had performed countless times. He knew every pothole to avoid, every tight turn to navigate, every traffic light's timing. This was his domain, predictable and secure. As he approached Maple and 8th, Stan's foot automatically moved to the brake pedal. It was muscle memory more than necessity. Nobody had used this stop in weeks. The building nearby had been empty since the old bookstore closed down, leaving just a stretch of cracked sidewalk and an old bus stop sign. But today was different. Stan blinked twice, making sure his eyes weren't playing tricks on him. A boy stood at the stop, small and still against the empty backdrop of the abandoned storefront. He looked about 12 or 13, wearing a faded gray hoodie that seemed to swallow his thin frame. His sneakers were visibly worn, the soles starting to separate at the edges, and they looked at least a size too small for his feet. Something about the boy made Stan's neck prickle. Maybe it was the way he stood so perfectly still, or how his eyes seemed fixed on some distant point. Stan pulled the bus to a stop, the doors opening with their familiar hiss. The boy stepped aboard with careful, measured movements. His eyes remained downcast as he reached into his pocket and pulled out exact change, each coin placed into the fare box with precise, almost mechanical movements. There was something unsettling about the deliberate way he moved, like each gesture had been carefully rehearsed. "Good morning," Stan offered warmly, trying to catch the boy's eye. But the child didn't respond or look up. He simply turned and walked to the back of the bus, his footsteps eerily quiet on the worn floor. Through the rearview mirror, Stan watched as the boy settled into the last row, sitting perfectly straight and staring straight ahead. A sudden chill ran down Stan's spine, despite the warm morning sun streaming through the windows. He shook his head, trying to dismiss the uneasy feeling. Kids could be shy after all. No need to read too much into it. Still, as Stan guided the bus back into traffic, he couldn't shake the image of the boy's careful movements and distant expression from his mind. Stan kept a watchful eye on his new passenger through the rearview mirror as the bus wound its way through the familiar streets of Clearview. The boy sat perfectly still in the last row, his gaze fixed on the passing scenery outside his window. Unlike the other passengers who fidgeted, checked their phones, or chatted with their neighbors, the boy remained motionless, almost statue-like in his stillness. Mrs. Hargrove's voice carried through the bus as she complained about her arthritis to anyone who would listen. The high school students giggled and whispered among themselves. Mr. Collins turned the pages of his newspaper with soft, rustling sounds. But the boy seemed to exist in his own bubble, completely detached from the life around him. Stan frowned slightly as he noticed something odd in the mirror. A brief flash caught his eye, something metallic reflecting the morning sunlight. The glint came from the boy's hands, which were folded in his lap. Stan adjusted his mirror slightly, trying to get a better look without being too obvious about it. The morning sun streamed through the windows, creating perfect conditions for Stan to catch another glimpse of whatever the boy was holding. It was definitely metal, with a smooth surface that caught the light. Before Stan could make out what it was, the boy's head turned slightly toward the mirror. Their eyes met for a brief moment in the reflection. The boy's reaction was immediate but controlled. Without any sign of panic or hurry, he calmly rolled down his sleeves, covering his hands and whatever he held. His movements were deliberate and precise, just like when he had boarded the bus. The metallic object disappeared from view, hidden beneath the worn fabric of his hoodie. Stan's fingers tightened slightly on the steering wheel. Something about the situation felt off. Most kids would have jumped or looked guilty if caught doing something they shouldn't, but this boy's reaction had been too measured, too controlled. It was as if he had been prepared for this exact moment. The bus hit a small pothole, causing the usual rattles and creaks. Several passengers shifted in their seats, but the boy remained perfectly still, his posture unchanged. Stan found himself wondering about what he had seen. Could it have been a watch? A piece of jewelry? A toy? But something in his gut told him it wasn't that simple. He wanted to ask the boy about it to make sure everything was okay. But what would he say? He had no real reason for concern beyond a feeling, and the last thing he wanted was to frighten a child who might just be shy. Instead, he kept driving, maintaining his regular route while stealing occasional glances at the mirror. The boy never moved from his position, his gaze now fixed straight ahead instead of out the window. His hands remained hidden within his sleeves, resting motionless in his lap. The morning sun continued to stream through the windows, but there were no more mysterious glints of light from the back row. Stan tried to focus on driving, on the familiar rhythm of stops and turns, but his mind kept returning to that metallic flash and the boy's eerily calm reaction. The usual comfort of his routine felt somehow disturbed, like a picture hanging slightly crooked on a wall. He couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't quite right, even as he told himself he was probably overreacting. Stan's heart skipped a beat as the metallic flash caught his eye again in the rearview mirror. This time, there was no mistaking what it was. The fluorescent bus lights gleamed off the sharp edge of a knife, sending a cold shiver down his spine. His fingers tightened around the steering wheel until his knuckles turned white. Mrs. Hargrove sat in her usual spot, thumbing through her phone, completely unaware. The group of high school students continued their animated chatter about weekend plans. Mr. Collins dozed quietly, his newspaper forgotten in his lap. Stan forced himself to take slow, steady breaths. 23 years of driving buses had taught him how to handle difficult situations. But this was different. His mouth felt dry as cotton as he watched the boy through quick glances in the mirror. The young passenger's face remained eerily calm, his fingers moving methodically over the blade's handle. "Stay calm," Stan whispered to himself so quietly that none of the passengers could hear. "Think this through." His mind raced through possible scenarios. If he slammed on the brakes or made any sudden moves, the knife could hurt someone. If he announced what he'd seen, panic would spread through the bus like wildfire. The boy might react badly if he felt threatened. Stan's hands were sweating now as he made a careful turn onto Oak Street. The familiar route felt different today, each moment stretched with tension. He couldn't shake the image of that sharp blade, partially hidden in the boy's sleeve, but definitely there. Through the mirror, Stan studied the boy more carefully. Despite his initial fear, he noticed something in the young passenger's expression. Not menace, but something closer to fear. The boy's shoulders were hunched, his body language defensive rather than aggressive. The way he held the knife seemed more protective than threatening. The realization didn't make Stan feel much better, but it helped him think more clearly. A scared kid with a weapon could be just as dangerous as someone with bad intentions. He needed to handle this delicately. Stan's police friend Mike had taught him the silent alarm procedure years ago. The small button under the dashboard would alert dispatch without any visible or audible signal. But even that felt risky. What if the boy noticed police cars following the bus? What if he panicked? Sweat trickled down Stan's back as he navigated through traffic, maintaining his usual driving pattern to avoid arousing suspicion. Every fiber of his being wanted to act, to do something, but he forced himself to move carefully, methodically, like any other morning. His right hand inched toward the silent alarm button, moving slowly so as not to draw attention. Through the mirror, he could see the boy was still focused on whatever was in his hands, those unnaturally steady movements continuing. Stan's finger hovered over the button as his mind worked through the consequences of each possible action. The weight of responsibility pressed down on him like a physical force. He had 15 other passengers to think about, all of them trusting him to get them safely to their destinations. But he also couldn't ignore a young boy who might need help, even if that help meant protecting him from himself. Stan took another deep breath, his decision made. With deliberate casualness, he reached down and pressed the silent alarm button, praying he'd made the right choice. He kept driving, his face a mask of everyday normalcy, while his heart pounded against his ribs like a drum. Stan's fingers trembled slightly as he reached for the radio mounted on the dashboard. He'd made hundreds of routine calls over his years of service, but this one was different. Lives could depend on how well he handled the next few minutes. "Dispatch, this is Route 27, Stan said, keeping his voice steady. He glanced in the rearview mirror, catching another glimpse of the boy. "I'm reporting a potential mechanical issue near Stop 42. Might need a Level 3 inspection when I get there." Level 3 was their code for immediate police response. Stan held his breath, waiting for the reply. "Copy that, Route 27, the dispatcher responded, her voice crackling through the speaker. "We'll have maintenance standing by at Stop 42. The boy's head snapped up at the sound of the radio, his eyes meeting Stan's in the mirror. There was something haunting in that gaze, not threatening exactly, but deeply troubled. Stan quickly looked away, pretending to focus on the road ahead. "This is just great," Mrs. Hargrove announced from her usual seat near the front, her umbrella tapping against the floor in irritation. "I have a hair appointment at 2:30. I can't be late again." "We'll do our best to keep the delay minimal, ma'am," Stan assured her, though his mind was racing with much bigger concerns than Mrs. Hargrove's hair appointment. The group of high school students barely seemed to notice the exchange, too engrossed in their own conversation. "And then Jessica said she wouldn't go to prom with him," one girl explained dramatically, while her friends gasped and giggled. Stan wished he could share their carefree attitude. Instead, his hands gripped the steering wheel tighter as he felt the weight of responsibility pressing down on him. Every passenger on this bus was under his care, and one of them was armed with a knife. Through the mirror, he watched the boy shift in his seat. His movements were careful, deliberate, as if he was trying not to draw attention to himself. But there was a new alertness in his posture, a tension that hadn't been there before the radio call. "Dispatch, just to confirm," Stan said into the radio again. "That'll be Stop 42, about 10 minutes from now." "Confirmed, Route 27, maintenance will be ready." The boy's eyes narrowed slightly at this exchange, and Stan saw his hand move beneath his sleeve where the knife was hidden. The movement sent a chill down Stan's spine, but he maintained his professional demeanor, nodding at a passenger who was pulling the cord for the next stop. As the bus continued its route, Stan felt like he was performing in a delicate ballet, balancing the need to appear normal with the urgent desire to get help as quickly as possible. Every second seemed to stretch longer than the last, filled with the constant awareness of the potential danger sitting quietly in the back row. The chatter of the other passengers continued around him, a surreal soundtrack to the tension he felt building with each passing moment. Stan kept driving, his movements automatic after years of experience. while his mind remained hyper-focused on the boy in the mirror. The knife remained hidden, but its presence loomed large in Stan's consciousness as they drew closer to stop 42. Stan eased the bus to a stop at the dimly lit corner of Elm and Pine. The familiar hiss of the hydraulic brakes echoed through the quiet evening air. Moths danced around the flickering streetlight above, casting shifting shadows across the empty sidewalk. His hands gripped the steering wheel so tight his knuckles had turned white, every muscle in his body tense with worry. Through the rearview mirror, he watched the boy, still hunched in the back seat, still clutching that knife. The metallic glint caught the light whenever the boy's sleeve shifted. Stan's stomach churned as he remembered the police scanner chatter from earlier about a missing kid. Could this be the same one? Mrs. Peterson and her grocery bags shuffled off the bus while two teenagers climbed aboard, laughing about something on their phones. They seemed oblivious to the tension hanging in the air. Stan envied their carefree attitude. His hand hovered over the radio mounted on the dashboard. One quick call and help would arrive within minutes, but something made him pause. The boy's posture had changed. Instead of the rigid alertness from before, his shoulders now slumped forward, his head bowed low, lips moving in what looked like a silent prayer or mantra. The knife was still there, but his white-knuckled grip seemed more defensive than threatening. Stan watched as the boy's eyes darted around nervously, like a cornered animal looking for escape routes. There was raw fear in those eyes, not the cold calculation of someone planning violence. The realization hit Stan hard. This kid wasn't a threat to others, he was terrified of something himself. The police scanner's earlier report echoed in Stan's mind. Be on lookout for missing juvenile, last seen near. He couldn't remember the exact location, but the description matched. Dark hoodie, young teen, traveling alone. The evening air felt heavy as Stan wrestled with his decision. His instincts as a driver told him to alert authorities about an armed passenger, but his heart saw something else, a scared kid who might need help more than handcuffs. With a soft sigh, Stan closed the bus doors. The hydraulics hissed again as the bus pulled away from the curb, streetlights casting long shadows through the windows. In the rearview mirror, he caught the boy's eyes for just a moment. The flash of fear there was unmistakable as the boy's grip tightened on the knife hidden in his sleeve. Stan kept driving, his mind racing but his exterior calm. Whatever was going on with this kid, charging in with sirens blazing might make things worse. For now, he'd watch and wait, hoping to understand more before making any moves that couldn't be taken back. Stan's eyes darted to the rearview mirror as movement caught his attention. Mia Henderson, one of the regular high school students, was getting up from her usual spot near the front of the bus. Her long brown ponytail swayed as she made her way down the aisle, ignoring the worried whispers from her friends. "Mia, don't," Sarah, her best friend, hissed. "That kid looks weird." But Mia just shook her head and continued toward the back of the bus. Stan watched carefully, his hands tightening on the steering wheel. The girl's kind heart usually led her to befriend everyone, but this situation made him nervous. Owen's body tensed visibly as Mia approached, his fingers wrapped tighter around whatever he was holding in his lap, hidden beneath his sleeves. Stan held his breath, ready to pull over if needed. "Hi there," Mia said softly, sliding into the seat across from Owen. Her smile was warm and genuine. "Mind if I sit here?" Owen's eyes darted between her and the window, but he gave a tiny shrug. Stan noticed his grip loosen slightly. "I'm Mia," she continued, her voice gentle and friendly. "I haven't seen you on this route before. Are you heading somewhere specific?" Owen stared at his lap. "Just around," he mumbled. "Cool," Mia nodded, seemingly unfazed by his short answer. "I take this bus every day after drama club. Where are you from?" Owen shifted uncomfortably. "Different places." Stan listened intently while keeping his eyes on the road. The boy's voice was barely above a whisper, but there was something in his tone, a mix of wariness and loneliness that made Stan's heart ache. "Must be interesting moving around a lot," Mia said. "I've lived here my whole life. Sometimes I think it would be nice to see other places." For the first time, Owen's shoulders relaxed slightly. His death grip on the concealed knife loosened just a bit more. "What's your name?" Mia asked after a moment of silence. Owen went still again. The question seemed to trouble him deeply. Stan watched in the mirror as various emotions flickered across the boy's face: fear, uncertainty, and something that looked like longing for connection. Finally, so quietly Stan almost missed it, the boy whispered, "Owen Smith." Mia's smile brightened. "Nice to meet you, Owen." Stan filed away the name, the first real piece of information he had about this mysterious passenger. Owen Smith. The name didn't tell him much, but it was something concrete to hold on to as he tried to understand the situation. The bus hummed steadily along the winding road as Mia continued making gentle conversation. Though Owen's responses remained brief, the crushing tension that had filled the bus earlier began to ease. He was still clearly on edge, but Mia's presence seemed to anchor him somewhat. Stan glanced at the rearview mirror again, observing how Owen's white-knuckled grip on the knife had loosened to a less desperate hold. The boy's eyes still darted around nervously, but they returned more and more often to Mia's kind face as she talked about simple things: her favorite subjects in school, her dog at home, the weather. Stan's knuckles whitened on the steering wheel as raised voices erupted from the front of the bus. Mrs. Peterson, a frail woman in her 70s, was jabbing her finger at a younger woman in a business suit. "I always sit here every Tuesday and Thursday. This is my seat." Mrs. Peterson's voice quavered with indignation. The younger woman rolled her eyes. "There's no assigned seating on public transportation. I paid my fare just like you did." Their argument grew louder, drawing everyone's attention. The high school students pulled out their phones to record the scene, while Mr. Collins lowered his newspaper with an irritated frown. Even Mia turned away from Owen to watch the commotion. Stan kept one eye on the road and another on the rearview mirror, where he could see Owen in the back seat. The boy's movements were careful, calculated. Taking advantage of the distraction, Owen slowly slipped the knife into his worn backpack. Stan felt his shoulders relax slightly, but years of driving had taught him to stay alert. His instincts proved right. Owen's hand disappeared into the bag again, emerging with a folded piece of paper that had clearly seen better days. The edges were worn soft, and several creases threatened to tear completely. Owen's fingers trembled as he carefully unfolded it, smoothing it across his lap. Stan squinted at the reflection in his mirror, trying to make out details without being obvious about it. The paper was definitely a map. He could see the familiar grid pattern of streets. But what caught his eye was the bold text in the upper corner: Clearview Asylum, closed 1989. The sight of those words made Stan's stomach clench. He remembered that place. Everyone in town did. The massive Victorian building had stood empty for decades before being demolished 5 years ago. It had been a source of local ghost stories and teenage dares, but something about Owen's intense focus on the map suggested this was more than idle curiosity. The boy's lips moved silently as his finger traced a path across the paper. His face was tight with concentration, shoulders hunched as if trying to make himself smaller in the seat. "Well, I never." Mrs. Peterson's voice cut through Stan's observations. She had finally given up her claim to the seat and was making her way toward the back of the bus, muttering under her breath. The younger woman looked smug as she settled into the disputed spot, tapping away at her phone. The other passengers gradually returned to their own activities. The high school students shared their videos, giggling. Mr. Collins disappeared behind his newspaper again. Mia cast one more concerned glance at Owen before turning to chat with her friends. Owen carefully refolded the map along its worn creases. His grip was white-knuckled as he clutched it tightly, staring out the window into the gathering darkness. The bus continued its journey through the night, its headlights cutting through the gloom as Stan guided it down the familiar route, though now everything felt different, less certain, more ominous. The night pressed against the bus windows like a heavy curtain, broken only by the occasional flicker of streetlights passing overhead. Stan's hands gripped the steering wheel tighter, his knuckles white under the dim dashboard lights. Every few seconds, his eyes darted to the rearview mirror, watching Owen's reflection in the back of the bus. The boy sat perfectly still, his thin fingers wrapped around the folded map. His face was turned toward the window, but his eyes seemed focused on something far beyond the darkness outside. The overhead lights cast shadows across his face, making him look even younger and more vulnerable than before. Stan squinted, adjusting the rear-view mirror slightly to get a better view of the map in Owen's hands. The paper was worn at the creases, yellowed with age. Even from this distance, the bold text at the top was clear enough. Clearview Asylum, closed 1989. A chill ran down Stan's spine as he remembered the stories his father used to tell about that place. "Place gave me the creeps," his father had said over dinner years ago. Folks would go missing around there. Never any proof, mind you, but everyone knew something wasn't right about that building. Stan watched as Owen's fingers traced a circle marked in red ink on the map. The location seemed to be on the asylum's grounds, though Stan couldn't make out exactly where. The boy's movements were precise, almost mechanical, as if he'd memorized every detail of the map but needed to confirm it again and again. The bus hummed steadily as it carried them through the empty stretch of road. Most passengers had dozed off, their heads bobbing gently with each small bump and turn. Mrs. Hargrove's soft snoring mixed with the engine's constant rumble. Even the usually chatty high school students had fallen quiet, their phones casting blue glows on their tired faces. But the silence only amplified Stan's unease. The asylum had been abandoned for decades, its buildings left to rot on the outskirts of town. Nobody went there anymore. Nobody except vandals and thrill-seeking teenagers. What business could a young boy like Owen have with such a place? Stan adjusted the mirror again, trying to catch more details from the map. Owen's grip tightened on the paper, and for a moment, their eyes met in the reflection. The boy's gaze was intense, almost pleading, before he quickly looked away and folded the map into a tight square. The road stretched ahead, empty and dark. Stan's thoughts raced with local legends about the asylum, stories of strange lights in the windows, unexplained noises, and people who ventured too close and came back changed. He'd always dismissed them as small-town gossip, but now, with this mysterious boy and his map, those old tales took on a new weight. The streetlights cast long shadows across the quiet streets of Clearview as Stan's bus idled at a red light. The engine's gentle rumble mixed with the muffled conversations of the remaining passengers, creating a cocoon of familiar sounds that usually brought comfort. But tonight was different. In the back of the bus, Owen's fingers twisted nervously around his hoodie strings, pulling them tight and then letting them loose again. His shoulders hunched forward, as if trying to make himself smaller in his seat. The worn fabric of his oversized hoodie seemed to swallow his thin frame as he peered out the window into the growing darkness. That's when he saw it, a figure standing perfectly still on the empty sidewalk. The stranger wore a black trench coat that hung heavy and motionless in the evening air. A wide-brimmed hat cast deep shadows across their face, making it impossible to distinguish any features. But Owen could feel their gaze fixed directly on the bus, unwavering and intense. Owen's breath caught in his throat. His fingers stopped fidgeting and gripped the edge of his seat instead, knuckles turning white. The blood drained from his face, as recognition hit him like a physical blow. His lips barely moved as he whispered, "He found me." The words carried such raw fear that they seemed to drop like stones in the quiet bus. Stan, who had been watching Owen through occasional glances in his mirror, noticed the sudden change. The boy's obvious distress made him forget his earlier wariness about the knife. "Hey, you all right, kid?" he called back, genuine concern coloring his voice. Owen didn't respond. He sat frozen, eyes locked on the mysterious figure outside. His chest rose and fell in quick, shallow breaths, and a thin sheen of sweat appeared on his forehead despite the cool evening air. The traffic light finally changed to green, its bright color reflecting off the wet pavement. Stan eased his foot off the brake, and the bus lurched forward. As they pulled away, the figure remained motionless, their shadowy form growing smaller in the side mirrors until it disappeared completely around the corner. Owen slumped lower in his seat, trying to disappear into the shadows. His eyes darted around the bus interior, scanning each passenger's face as if expecting to find more threats. His lips moved again, forming the words, "It's starting," in a whisper so quiet it was almost lost in the rumble of the engine. The other passengers continued their conversations, oblivious to the drama unfolding in their midst. Mrs. Hargrove complained about her aching joints to anyone who would listen, while a group of teenagers near the middle of the bus laughed at something on their phones. But in the back seat, Owen's fear was a tangible thing, filling his corner of the bus with an almost electric tension. The bus engine sputtered and died with a wheezing sound that made several passengers grab their seats. Stan pumped the gas pedal a few times, but nothing happened. The vehicle drifted to the side of the road before coming to a complete stop. "Ladies and gentlemen," Stan announced, trying to keep his voice steady, "we're experiencing some engine trouble. I'll contact dispatch for assistance." He reached for his radio, but only static crackled through the speaker. The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows across the abandoned buildings that lined both sides of the street. Broken windows gaped like empty eye sockets, and weeds pushed through cracks in the sidewalk. The whole area felt wrong. Too quiet, too empty. Mrs. Hargrove's voice cut through the silence. "This is unacceptable. I have an important appointment to keep." "Yes, some of us have places to be," another passenger chimed in. The complaint spread through the bus like wildfire. Some passengers pulled out their phones, groaning when they couldn't get a signal. Others pressed their faces against the windows, peering anxiously at their surroundings. Owen remained still in his seat, but his eyes were fixed on something outside. Through the dusty window, a dense patch of woods loomed in the distance, its trees casting dark shadows in the fading light. Without warning, he stood up. "This is where I need to go," he said quietly, his voice barely carrying over the frustrated chatter of the other passengers. Stan turned in his seat, frowning. "What are you talking about, kid? We're in the middle of nowhere." Owen didn't respond. His face was set with determination as he gripped his backpack tightly. "Hey, you can't just walk off into those woods," Stan protested. "It's getting dark and it's not safe out there." But Owen acted as if he hadn't heard. His movements were purposeful as he made his way down the aisle, ignoring the curious stares of the other passengers. "Someone stop that boy," Mrs. Hargrove called out, but no one moved. Stan watched helplessly as Owen reached the door. With steady hands, Owen pulled the emergency release lever, and the doors hissed open. Cool evening air rushed into the bus, carrying with it the musty smell of abandoned buildings and overgrown vegetation. Without looking back, Owen stepped off the bus. His sneakers crunched against the gravel as he began walking toward the woods, his figure growing smaller against the darkening sky. The other passengers crowded around the windows, watching as Owen's silhouette became harder to distinguish in the growing shadows. Some whispered among themselves, while others shook their heads in disbelief. "Should we do something?" one of the high school students asked, but nobody had an answer. Stan's feet moved before his mind could catch up. He rushed after Owen, his heart pounding against his ribs. "Wait!" he called out, his voice echoing through the empty street. But Owen kept walking, his shoulders hunched, his steps quick and determined. When Stan got closer, Owen suddenly turned around. His face was pale in the fading light, his eyes wide with a fear that made Stan's stomach clench. "If I don't, they'll find all of you," Owen whispered. The words hung in the air like frost, sending a chill down Stan's spine. Before Stan could respond, Owen darted into the trees, leaving only rustling leaves in his wake. Stan stood there, his mouth half open with unspoken questions, as Owen's small figure disappeared into the growing darkness. Back on the bus, Mia watched the scene unfold through the window. She grabbed Luke's arm, her fingers digging into his sleeve. "We can't let him go alone," she said, her voice tight with worry. Luke shook his head, running a hand through his dark hair. "Are you crazy? We don't know what's going on. He had a knife, Mia, a knife." "Something's wrong," Mia insisted. "Did you see his face? He's scared, Luke, really scared." She pulled out her phone and switched on its flashlight. "I'm going. You can stay here if you want." Luke groaned but reached for his own phone. "My mom's gonna kill me," he muttered, following Mia as she slipped off the bus. Their flashlight beams bounced off the trees as they made their way into the woods. The light created strange shadows that seemed to move and shift around them. Branches cracked under their feet, each sound making Luke jump. Stan watched them go, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. He knew he should call the police, but something held him back. Owen's warning echoed in his mind. Who were they? And what would happen if they found everyone? Through the trees, he could see Mia and Luke's flashlights growing smaller. Owen was somewhere ahead of them, a shadow among shadows. The woods seemed to come alive with strange noises, rustling leaves, snapping twigs, and something else, something that made the hair on the back of Stan's neck stand up. Stan's hands trembled as he dialed 911 on his phone. The dispatcher's calm voice felt like a lifeline in the growing darkness. "Yes, we have a broken-down bus on Old Mill Road," he reported, his voice tight. "But that's not the main problem. We've got 3 minors who've wandered into the woods. One of them might be armed." After hanging up, Stan stared at the dark tree line. The police were at least 15 minutes away. His conscience gnawed at him. Those kids were out there alone, possibly in danger. With a deep breath, he pulled out his phone and switched on its flashlight. "I'll be back," he called to the remaining passengers. "Please stay on the bus." The woods swallowed him quickly. Branches scratched at his face as he pushed through the undergrowth. The beam of his phone flashlight seemed pitifully small against the pressing darkness. Behind him, the warm glow of the bus lights grew fainter until they disappeared completely. His heart pounded as he moved deeper into the woods. Then he heard voices ahead, young voices. Following the sound, he caught up with Mia and Luke, who were examining the ground with their flashlights. "Kids!" he called out, making them jump. "What were you thinking?" "Look," Mia said, pointing her light at the ground. "There's a trail here." Stan saw it too, an old path nearly hidden under years of fallen leaves and creeping vines. It wound through the trees like a snake, disappearing into the darkness ahead. They followed it cautiously, their 3 flashlight beams dancing over the uneven ground. The temperature seemed to drop with each step. Luke hugged himself, shivering. "Maybe we should go back," he suggested. "Wait," Mia whispered, pointing ahead. "Look at that." Through the trees, a massive structure loomed. As they drew closer, Stan's flashlight revealed crumbling brick walls covered in thick vines. Broken windows gaped like missing teeth, and above the main entrance, barely visible letters spelled out Clearview Asylum. "This is a bad idea," Stan said firmly. "We need to head back and let the police handle this." But before anyone could respond, a sound echoed from within the building, a metallic screech followed by a hollow bang. Everyone froze. "Owen's in there," Mia said, her voice barely above a whisper. "We can't leave him." Stan opened his mouth to argue, but another crash rang out from inside the asylum. The sound seemed to pull them forward despite their fear, like a magnet drawing metal. They stood before the entrance, their flashlights illuminating the cracked steps leading to a massive wooden door. Broken glass crunched under their feet. A cold wind whistled through the trees, carrying the musty smell of decay. The strange noise came again, louder this time, echoing through the empty halls beyond the door. Mia took a step forward, her flashlight beam steady. "We have to find Owen," she whispered, reaching for the rusted door handle. The group, Stan, Mia, and Luke, followed Owen into the dark asylum. Thunder cracked overhead, sending bright flashes through broken windows. Their footsteps echoed on the cracked tile floor as they moved deeper into the building. The air felt heavy and stale, thick with decades of dust. Somewhere in the distance, water dripped steadily, the sound bouncing off bare walls. "Watch your step," Stan whispered, sweeping his flashlight beam across the floor. The light revealed peeling paint and faded murals of pastoral scenes that seemed to mock the building's grim reality. Graffiti covered many walls, most of it typical teenage stuff, but some messages made Stan's skin crawl. "Save us," was scratched deeply into one wall. Below it, someone had written, "They know," in what looked like red paint. Luke stayed close to Mia, jumping at every sound. "This place gives me the creeps," he muttered. As they moved through the corridors, they found themselves in what appeared to be an administrative area. Papers littered the floor, and rusted filing cabinets stood with drawers hanging open. Mia picked up some of the scattered documents. "These are patient records," she said, her voice hushed. "Look at this. They were doing experiments here, testing new treatments on people with mental illness." She shuffled through more papers, her face growing pale. Some of these, they're horrible. Owen moved ahead of them with strange confidence, as if he knew exactly where he was going. His movements were precise, almost mechanical. He didn't hesitate at intersections or check different doors. He simply walked forward with determination. "Owen," Stan called out softly, "have you been here before?" Owen didn't answer. His hand kept drifting to his pocket where the knife was hidden. Their exploration led them through various rooms. In one, they found rusty medical equipment that made Luke gag. Another room held rows of metal bed frames, their mattresses long rotted away. In a corner, Mia's flashlight caught something that made her gasp. A child's doll, its dress stained dark brown. "Look at these," Stan said, holding up some old photographs. They showed patients with vacant eyes and terrified expressions. Written on the back of one photo was, "Ward 13, Subject 7. Owen's steps quickened. When Stan tried to question him about his familiarity with the building, Owen just shook his head and pressed on. Finally, they reached a heavy metal door. Faded red letters spelled out, "Ward 13 above it. Owen stopped so suddenly that Luke almost ran into him. The boy stared at the door, his whole body rigid. His breathing became shallow and quick. Without speaking, he knelt in front of the door and pulled out his knife. His hand shook as he inserted the blade into the lock. "Owen, wait," Mia whispered urgently. "We don't know what's in there." Stan reached for Owen's shoulder. "Maybe we should—" A loud click echoed through the corridor as the lock gave way under Owen's efforts. The heavy door groaned open, releasing a cloud of stale air that made everyone cough. Stan swept his flashlight beam across the room, revealing walls plastered with yellowed newspaper clippings and faded photographs. Papers crunched beneath their feet as they stepped inside, the dust so thick it seemed to float like snow in their flashlight beams. "What is this place?" Mia whispered, her voice tight with anxiety. She moved closer to the walls, examining the chaotic collection of documents pinned there. Luke followed behind her, his own light illuminating a large desk in the center of the room. "It's like someone was trying to solve a mystery," he said, picking up a crumpled paper. "Look at all these connections they've drawn." Stan noticed how the papers and string created a web across the walls, everything somehow leading back to a central point, the asylum itself. His stomach churned as he read headlines about missing children and government cover-ups. "These dates go back decades," Stan muttered, studying a timeline scratched into one wall. "Whatever happened here, someone's been tracking it for years." A sharp intake of breath from Owen drew their attention. The boy stood frozen, staring at the ceiling with wide, terrified eyes. Above them, scratched into the paint in jagged letters, were the words, "They are watching." Owen quickly looked away, his face pale. "Owen?" Mia approached him carefully. "Are you okay?" Instead of answering, Owen moved to the desk, his hands shaking as he picked up a photograph. The others gathered around him, peering at the image. It showed a group of children standing in neat rows before the asylum's main entrance. Their faces were solemn, almost vacant. "It's us," Owen whispered, his voice barely audible. His finger traced over one of the small figures in the photo. "I was here. We all were." Stan leaned closer, studying the photograph. The children wore matching gray uniforms, and behind them stood adults in white coats, their faces stern and clinical. "What do you mean, Owen? What happened here?" Before Owen could answer, Luke called out from near the wall, "Guys, look at this." He pointed to a series of fresh footprints in the dust, leading from the door to the desk. "Someone's been here recently." The revelation sent a chill through the group. The footprints were clear and precise, unlike their own scattered marks. They told a story of someone who knew exactly what they were looking for. Owen clutched the photograph tighter, his knuckles white. "They never stopped," he muttered. "The experiments, the children, all of it. They just moved it somewhere else." A soft sound echoed from the hallway. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, growing closer. The group froze, their flashlights dimming as if responding to their fear. The footsteps continued, each one louder than the last, moving steadily toward Ward 13. The fluorescent beam cut through the darkness like a knife, sweeping across the dusty floor through the door's cracks. The group huddled together in the hidden room, their hearts pounding in unison. Stan instinctively moved in front of the teenagers while Mia gripped Luke's arm tightly. Owen pressed himself against the far wall, his knuckles white around the handle of his knife. The door handle rattled, the sound echoing in the tense silence. With an ominous creak, the door swung open, revealing a tall figure in a black trench coat. His flashlight beam danced across their faces, finally settling on Owen. Though shadows obscured most of his features, his mouth curved into what might have been a smile. "Owen," he said, his voice smooth as silk but cold as ice. "It's time to come home." Owen's reaction was immediate and violent. He thrust the knife forward, his whole body shaking. "Stay away!" The scream tore from his throat, raw with terror. The man stepped into the room, raising his hands in a gesture that should have been reassuring, but somehow made everyone more uncomfortable. "Son, you're confused. I'm your father. I've been looking everywhere for you." Something about his movement seemed wrong, too precise, too calculated. His eyes never blinked, and his stance remained unnaturally still. Stan noticed how the man's gaze stayed fixed on Owen, dismissing everyone else as if they were furniture. "Is this true?" Mia asked Owen softly. "Is he really your father?" The man cut her off before Owen could respond. "This doesn't concern you. Owen needs to come with me now." "You're lying." Owen's voice cracked with emotion. "You're not my father." His fingers tightened around the knife and tears began streaming down his face. "My father is dead. You're one of them. You're one of the people who hurt us." The man's facade cracked slightly. His smile tightened, and his voice took on a sharp edge. "The rest of you need to leave. Now. This is a family matter." "We're not going anywhere," Stan said firmly, though his voice trembled slightly. The man's face hardened. "This doesn't concern any of you. Step aside, or there will be consequences." Owen's eyes darted around wildly before landing on the desk. In one fluid motion, he lunged forward and snatched up a stack of papers. "You can't have me again," he shouted, his voice echoing off the walls. Then he bolted, squeezing past the man in the doorway and disappearing into the dark hallway beyond. The group didn't hesitate. They followed Owen's lead, running after him into the darkness of the asylum's corridors, leaving the man in the trench coat behind. The fluorescent lights flickered overhead as the group huddled in a dusty storage room. Owen slid down the wall, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The papers he'd snatched rustled in his trembling hands. Tears carved paths through the grime on his face. Owen's voice cracked. He swallowed hard and tried again. "I wasn't always like this. Running. Scared." Stan knelt beside him, keeping his voice gentle. "Take your time, son." Owen's fingers traced the edges of the papers. "They took us when we were little. Kids who were different. Special, they said." He let out a bitter laugh. "They kept us in a facility underground. Said we were going to help people, make the world better." Mia sat cross-legged on the floor, her eyes wide with concern. "What did they do to you?" "Experiments, tests, Owen's voice wavered. "They wanted to see what we could do, push our limits. Some kids could move things with their minds, others could read thoughts." He closed his eyes tight. "I could manipulate time. Just a little. Make it slow down, speed up. They'd hook us up to machines, inject us with drugs, try to make us stronger." Luke shifted uncomfortably. "And that man out there, Dr. Harrison," Owen spat the name like poison. "He ran the tests. He'd stand there, writing in his notebook while we screamed." Owen's knuckles whitened around the papers. "He's not my father. He's a monster." The distant sound of footsteps echoed through the halls. Owen flinched. "There were others like me," he continued quickly, his words tumbling out. "Sarah could control electricity. Marcus could heal people, but the tests, they were too much. Some kids didn't survive." His voice broke. "I watched them die." Stan placed a steadying hand on Owen's shoulder. How did you get away? One day during a test, my powers and they went crazy. Time started jumping around, the guards got confused. I ran. Owen wiped his eyes with his sleeve. I've been running ever since. They want me back. Want to study why I survived when others didn't. Why here? Mia asked softly. Why the asylum? This was one of their facilities. There are records here, proof of what they did. Owen clutched the stolen papers to his chest. I thought if I could find evidence. Owen! Dr. Harrison's voice boomed through the hallway, closer now. You can't hide forever. Owen scrambled to his feet, panic flashing in his eyes. We have to keep moving, he said, his voice steadying with determination. If he catches us, it's over. The fluorescent light flickered overhead in the asylum's central hall, casting dancing shadows across the peeling walls. The trench-coated man stood tall, his presence commanding attention as he faced Owen and the group. His voice cut through the musty air like a blade. You're a ticking time bomb, Owen, he said, each word measured and precise. Your powers aren't just party tricks. They're dangerous, and you know it. Owen's hands trembled at his sides. You're wrong, I would never hurt anyone. The man's laugh echoed off the crumbling walls. Really? Like you didn't hurt anyone at the Henderson facility? Or should we discuss the incident in Millbrook? Owen flinched as if struck. Mia stepped forward, positioning herself between Owen and the man. Leave him alone. He's just a kid. A kid who could tear this building apart with a thought, the man countered. His eyes never left Owen as he continued. Let me tell you about Marcus Chen. Another special one, like Owen. He thought he could control it too. Until the day he couldn't. 27 people died when he lost control. The building just collapsed in on itself. Time went haywire. Some of the victims aged decades and seconds. Liam, who had been quiet until now, shifted uncomfortably. Owen, is what he's saying true? About your powers? Owen's voice cracked. The air around his hands rippled like heat waves rising from hot pavement. A nearby light bulb exploded in a shower of sparks. See? The man gestured at the broken glass. It's already starting. He can't control it when he's emotional. That was an accident, Mia insisted, but doubt had crept into her voice. They're always accidents, the man said softly, until they're not, until someone dies. The group exchanged nervous glances. Owen backed away, his eyes darting between their faces, seeing the fear beginning to take root. The trench-coated man took a step closer, his footsteps echoing in the tense silence. I'm not your enemy, kid, he said, locking eyes with Owen. But if you can't control yourself, you'll end up killing everyone here. Owen's fists clenched, and for a moment his eyes glowed with an otherworldly light before dimming again. The group stood frozen, caught between trust and terror, as silence filled the decrepit hall. In the dim confines of the asylum's records wing, Mia's flashlight beam cut through decades of dust, illuminating shelves of forgotten files and weathered furniture. The office she'd discovered felt frozen in time, with papers still scattered across the desk as if their owner had left in a hurry and never returned. The musty smell of decay hung heavy in the air. Her fingers traced the spines of old folders until something caught her eye, a leather-bound diary wedged behind a filing cabinet. The binding was cracked and worn, but the pages remained intact. Mia carefully extracted it, wiping away layers of grime. Opening the diary, she found neat handwriting filling the yellowed pages. Property of Sarah Mitchell, RN, was inscribed on the first page. Mia settled into a creaky office chair and began to read. The early entries were mundane, daily routines, patient observations, supply requests. But as Mia turned the pages, the tone shifted dramatically. The nurse's writing grew more frantic, describing special patients brought in under cover of darkness. Children with extraordinary abilities. Today they brought in another one entry read. Just a boy, couldn't be more than 7. They say he can do things with time itself, the way he looks at me. Those eyes hold something ancient and terrifying. Mia's hands trembled as she read further. The nurse detailed cruel experiments, children screaming in pain, mysterious men in suits taking notes. Some children disappeared without explanation. Others suffered worse fates. The final entries focused obsessively on one child, a boy whose power over time grew stronger each day. The temporal distortions are getting worse, the nurse wrote. Yesterday, an entire wing aged 50 years in minutes. We can't control him. God help us if his power fully manifests. The last entry was different. The writing was rushed, barely legible. He's losing control. The barriers between past and present are breaking down. We never should have pushed him this far. If anyone finds this, you must understand. This power was never meant to be contained. It will consume everything. I can hear the screaming starting again. I have to... The entry ended abruptly. A dark, reddish-brown stain spread across the bottom of the page. Mia stared at the diary, her heart pounding. Everything Owen had said about his past, about the experiments, it was all true. But the nurse's warning suggested something even more terrifying. Owen's powers weren't just dangerous. They were potentially catastrophic. From somewhere in the asylum's maze of corridors, voices called her name. Mia clutched the diary tight, her knuckles white with tension. It's true. All of it, she whispered into the empty office. As she stood to leave, something subtle shifted in the air around her. Time itself seemed to waver, like heat rising from summer pavement. The sensation lasted only a moment, but it left Mia with an unsettling certainty. Whatever force Owen controlled was far beyond anyone's understanding. The asylum's main hall filled with tension as Mia rushed back to the group, her face pale and hands trembling as she clutched the leather-bound diary. "You need to see this," she said, her voice shaking. "It proves everything Owen told us." Before she could explain further, a deep rumble shook the building. Dust cascaded from the ceiling, and the few working lights flickered erratically. Owen suddenly dropped to his knees, crying out in pain. His eyes began to glow with an eerie blue light as he pressed his hands against his temples. "Owen!" Mia rushed toward him but stumbled as the air grew thick and heavy like moving through syrup. Static electricity crackled around them, making their hair stand on end. The walls seemed to pulse and warp. Shadows stretched and contracted in impossible ways. Stan reached out to steady himself against a wall, but his hand passed through it as if it wasn't quite solid. "What's happening?" he gasped. Time began to fold in on itself. Echoes of their earlier conversation replayed around them like ghostly recordings. They watched, horrified, as phantom versions of themselves argued in the hallway. The same scene from minutes ago playing out on repeat. "Make it stop!" Luke shouted, but his voice came out distorted, speaking the words before and after he opened his mouth. Objects throughout the hall defied gravity and logic. A fallen chair lifted off the ground, then crashed back down, only to reverse its movement and float up again. Papers swirled in impossible patterns, some moving forward through time while others moved backward. Owen's scream pierced through the chaos, raw and desperate. The sound reverberated through the hall, amplifying the distortions. Reality bent and twisted more severely. Fragments of different moments overlapped and collided. The group saw themselves entering the asylum, leaving the bus, all happening simultaneously in a dizzying display. The concrete floor rippled like water. Cracks appeared in the walls, sealed themselves, and reappeared in different places. The group struggled to maintain their balance as time itself became unstable around them. Finally, Owen's eyes rolled back and he slumped forward. As his consciousness faded, the temporal distortions began to settle. The phantom images faded, and objects returned to their normal behavior. The group rushed to Owen's side, helping him into a sitting position. Their faces showed a mix of concern and fear as they looked at the boy who had just bent reality itself. In the shadows at the edge of the hall, the trench-coated man observed the scene, his expression grim and knowing. His face. The asylum's main hall stood frozen in an eerie silence, the aftermath of Owen's time distortion still lingering in the air. Dust particles hung suspended, catching what little light filtered through the grimy windows. The trench-coated man's footsteps echoed against the crumbling walls as he stepped forward, his face set in grim determination. "I've seen what happens when these powers go unchecked," he said, his voice carrying across the empty space. I'm here to prevent another catastrophe." Mia immediately moved in front of Owen, who sat slumped against the wall, exhausted from the recent surge of his abilities. Her hands balled into fists as she planted herself firmly between them. The man reached into his coat and pulled out a sleek tranquilizer gun. The metallic shine made everyone flinch. "Step aside," he commanded. "This isn't about what any of us want anymore. It's about protecting reality itself." "You're lying," Mia shot back, though uncertainty flickered across her face. "Owen needs help, not whatever you're planning to do to him." The man's expression softened slightly, but his grip on the gun remained steady. "Do you know what happened in 1989, when this asylum closed?" He gestured to the walls around them. A child like Owen lost control. Time itself started to unravel. We barely contained it, but dozens died in the process. The group shifted uncomfortably, exchanging worried glances. Stan took a half step forward but stopped, torn between protecting Owen and considering the man's words. "These abilities," the man continued, "they're like a cancer. They grow stronger, more unstable. What you saw today, that's just the beginning. Soon, he won't be able to control it at all." Owen lifted his head weakly. Is that true?" "You've felt it, haven't you? The power building up, becoming harder to contain?" Mia's voice cracked with emotion. "It doesn't matter. We can help him learn to control it. You can't just take him away." The man raised the tranquilizer gun, aiming it carefully. "I'm sorry, but I can't take that risk. Not again." Tension crackled through the air as everyone held their breath. The man's finger tightened on the trigger. In one fluid motion, he squeezed, sending the dart whistling through the air. Mia reacted instantly, throwing herself sideways and shoving Owen clear of the shot. The dart struck the wall behind them with a dull thud. Straightening up, Mia fixed the man with a fierce glare. Her voice came out low and dangerous, trembling with barely contained fury. "If you want him, you'll have to go through me." The man lowered the gun slightly, his expression unreadable as silence descended once again over the asylum's main hall. In the dim corner of the asylum room, Owen huddled against the wall, his thin frame shaking. The encounter with the agents had left him drained, both physically and emotionally. Stan watched as the boy wrapped his arms around himself, trying to make himself smaller. Owen's voice cracked. "I don't know how to control it. Sometimes it just happens, especially when I'm scared." Stan knelt beside him, placing a steady hand on Owen's trembling shoulder. "Take your time, son. You're safe right now." The touch seemed to anchor Owen. He took a shaky breath and continued. "The powers, they come and go. Time gets weird around me when I'm stressed. Electronics go haywire. I never asked for any of this." The others in the group shifted uncomfortably. A woman near the back whispered something to her companion, casting nervous glances at Owen. "They've been after me since I can remember," Owen said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Men in white coats, watching me through glass walls, running tests." He paused, his eyes distant. "And there's this man in a trench coat. He shows up whenever everything falls apart, like he's waiting for me to fail." "We can't stay here with him," someone in the group muttered. "He's dangerous." "What if those agents come back?" another added. "We should just—" "That's enough," Stan cut in, his voice firm but calm. "This boy needs our help. Whatever's happening here, whatever they did to him, we can't just abandon him to those people." Owen looked up at Stan, surprise flickering across his face. "But what can we do?" a skeptical voice asked. Stan stood, facing the group. "We find out why they want him. What they did in this place. Owen's not the only victim here. This asylum holds secrets that need to come to light." His words hung in the air, and slowly the tension began to ease. A few people nodded, while others still looked uncertain, but less hostile. Stan turned back to Owen, crouching down to meet his eyes. "We'll figure this out together," he said quietly. "You're not alone anymore." Owen nodded, wiping his eyes with his sleeve. Outside, footsteps and muffled voices echoed through the halls, suggesting the agents were regrouping. The cold night air bit at their faces as they burst through the asylum's heavy doors. Owen's breath came in ragged gasps, his legs trembling with each step as Stan guided him forward. Behind them, the screech of tires announced the arrival of unmarked black vehicles, their headlights cutting through the darkness like searchlights. "This way," Stan urged, pulling Owen toward the dense tree line that loomed ahead. The rest of their group scattered as agents poured out of the vehicles, their boots crunching on gravel. Bright beams from powerful searchlights swept across the ground, forcing them to split up. Owen stumbled along beside Stan, joined by 3 others from their group. The forest swallowed them into its shadows, branches whipping at their faces as they ran deeper into the darkness. "They're surrounding us," one of their companions whispered urgently, as more lights appeared through the trees ahead. Stan pulled them behind a large oak tree, his hand steady on Owen's shoulder. "Easy, kid. Just breathe." Owen's hands were shaking as he pressed them against his temples. The air around them began to feel heavy, like molasses. Time itself seemed to stretch and bend as Owen's power surged through him. The agents charging toward their position suddenly froze mid-step, then jerked backward, repeating the same few seconds of movement over and over. Some called out in confusion as they found themselves walking in circles, unable to break free from the temporal loop Owen had created. "What's happening to them?" one of their group members asked, watching in amazement as the agents struggled against invisible bonds of time. "Owen's keeping them trapped," Stan explained quietly, noting how the boy's face had gone pale with effort. "But we need to move. He can't hold this forever." They crept through the forest while their pursuers remained caught in Owen's temporal web. The agents' voices echoed strangely, repeating fragments of shouted orders that no longer made sense. "Is this safe?" another escapee questioned, eyeing Owen nervously. "What if he loses control?" "He won't," Stan said firmly, though he could feel Owen trembling beneath his steadying hand. The boy's skin felt cold and clammy with sweat. They pushed on through the undergrowth, the sounds of confused agents growing fainter behind them. Owen stumbled more frequently now, his energy clearly flagging. The temporal loops he'd created were taking their toll. After what felt like hours of careful navigation through the dark forest, they emerged onto an abandoned road. The night was quiet here, broken only by the distant echo of trapped voices still calling out in confusion. Owen's legs finally gave out and he collapsed forward. Stan caught him before he hit the ground, scooping the exhausted boy into his arms. Owen's head lolled against Stan's shoulder, his face drawn and pale in the moonlight. "You did good, kid," Stan murmured, adjusting his grip on Owen's limp form. "You did real good." The group stumbled through the dense undergrowth until they found the cabin, its weathered walls barely visible in the darkness. Stan approached first, flashlight beam cutting through cobwebs and dust as he checked each room. The floorboards creaked under his feet, but the structure seemed solid enough. "It's clear," he called out. "Not exactly the Hilton, but it'll do." The others filed in, helping Owen to an old couch where he slumped, still weak from using his powers. Someone found dry wood near the fireplace, and soon warmth filled the small space. The dancing flames cast long shadows on the walls as the group settled in, sharing what little food they had salvaged. Owen stirred, blinking slowly as consciousness fully returned. He felt the weight of their stares, some concerned, others wary. The crackling fire filled the silence until he finally spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "I should tell you everything," he said. "You deserve to know the truth." Stan sat beside him, offering quiet support as Owen gathered his thoughts. The boy's hands trembled slightly as he began his story. "My mom knew what I could do before anyone else. She saw the signs when I was little, toys moving backwards in time, moments repeating themselves." Owen's voice grew stronger as he continued. "We never stayed in one place too long. New towns, new names, always running. She homeschooled me, kept me away from others. I didn't understand why back then, but she was trying to protect me." He paused, pain flickering across his face. "We had a friend, someone Mom trusted. She told him about my abilities, thinking he could help us. But he..." Owen's voice cracked. "He betrayed us, told them where to find us. Men came in the middle of the night, Mom fought them, told me to run. I never saw her again." The cabin fell silent except for the popping of the fire. Owen wrapped his arms around himself, lost in the memory. There was one man who always seemed to be there watching from a distance. The one in the trench coat. He never tried to grab me himself, but he was always there when the others came close. I think... Owen swallowed hard. I think he's the one who turned our friend against us. He's been orchestrating everything. Stan leaned forward, his brow furrowed. Details from Owen's story nagged at him, patterns that seemed familiar somehow. The boy's description of coordinated pursuit, of careful surveillance, spoke of resources and organization beyond what he'd imagined. "We'll figure this out, Owen," Stan said firmly. "You're not alone anymore." The group began preparing for sleep, arranging blankets and jackets into makeshift beds. Stan remained by the fire, watching as Owen drifted off. His eyes fell on a piece of equipment the boy had brought from the asylum, something about the faded logo catching his attention. With a jolt, he recognized it, the same logo that adorned his bus company's uniforms. The first rays of dawn crept through the cabin's dusty windows as Stan examined the equipment Owen had brought. His hands trembled as he traced the familiar corporate logo, 3 interlocking circles with a stark geometric pattern. It was the same design that adorned his bus company uniform, the one he'd worn proudly for 15 years. "I can't believe I never saw it," he muttered, his voice thick with emotion. He gathered the group around the worn wooden table, laying out the equipment where everyone could see. "This logo," Stan said, pointing to the marking. "It belongs to TransCore Industries. They own the bus company I work for." His words hung heavy in the musty air. Owen's eyes widened with recognition. "That's them," he whispered. "The people who..." His voice trailed off, unable to finish the sentence. Stan ran his fingers through his gray hair, his face etched with guilt. "All those years, I was just driving my route, thinking I was helping people get where they needed to go. But now..." He looked at Owen, his eyes filled with remorse. "I might have been helping them track kids like you." The memories came flooding back, mysterious deliveries to unmarked buildings, passengers who never quite seemed right, schedule changes that made no sense. "There were these special routes," Stan continued. "Night runs to places that weren't on any regular schedule. I never questioned it. I should have questioned it." The group sat in stunned silence. One of the escapees, an older woman, spoke up first. "You couldn't have known, Stan. They're experts at hiding things in plain sight." But Stan shook his head. "I should have seen the signs, those empty stops that suddenly had passengers, the weird schedule changes, the way certain people would appear and disappear." He looked at Owen again. "I'm so sorry." Owen surprised everyone by reaching out and placing his hand on Stan's arm. "You're helping me now," he said quietly. "That's what matters." The group began discussing their options. Some suggested going to the media, others recommended laying low. A heated debate broke out about whether they should try to gather more evidence or focus on staying hidden. "We need to understand how deep this goes," Stan insisted. "TransCore isn't just a bus company. They're involved in technology, research, infrastructure. They're everywhere." As the discussion continued, Stan walked to the cabin window, staring at the crumpled logo in his hand. "They've been in my life this whole time," he murmured softly. His fingers closed around the metal emblem, crushing it into a twisted shape. The morning sun cast long shadows across the cabin floor as they prepared to leave their temporary sanctuary. Owen sat cross-legged on the floor of the dimly lit bunker, his eyes closed in concentration. The fluorescent light above him flickered erratically, responding to his powers. Around him, the rest of the group watched intently as he demonstrated his ability to manipulate the electronic lock on a briefcase Ethan had brought. "See? Just like that," Owen said, his voice tight with strain as the lock clicked open without a key. Tasha nodded approvingly, her dark eyes scanning the walls covered in documents and photographs. Red strings connected various pieces of evidence, creating a complex web of the corporation's activities. "This will be essential for getting past their security systems," she said, marking another point on the blueprint spread across a weathered table. Nathan, dressed in a wrinkled suit that betrayed his corporate past, traced a path on the blueprint with his finger. "The main server room is here," he explained. "But watch out for the motion sensors in this corridor." Ethan double-checked the communications equipment laid out on a rickety folding table. "These earpieces are encrypted," he said, passing them out. "They won't be able to intercept our signals." Sophia moved between them, checking everyone's vitals and handing out water bottles. "Remember to stay hydrated," she insisted, pausing to squeeze Owen's shoulder supportively. "Especially you, Owen. Using your abilities takes a lot out of you." The group gathered around the central table as Tasha outlined the final details of their plan. The bunker's stale air grew heavy with tension as she pointed out critical entry points and timing windows. "Once we're inside," she explained, "we'll have exactly 20 minutes before the security protocols reset. Owen, you'll need to maintain control of the systems for that entire period." Owen swallowed hard but nodded. "I can do it." "Nathan," Tasha continued, "you'll guide us through the layout. Ethan will handle any tech issues we encounter. Sophia, stay alert for any medical needs." She straightened up, her expression grave. "And remember, if anything goes wrong, we stick to the backup plan. No heroes." The dim light cast long shadows as they made final preparations. Ethan distributed small cameras and USB drives designed to collect evidence. Sophia packed a compact medical kit. Nathan reviewed the building's security rotations one last time. Owen stood alone for a moment, staring at the photos of other children who had been experimented on. His hands trembled slightly as he touched one of the images. Sophia noticed and approached him quietly. "We're going to stop them," she said softly. "Because of you, we have a chance to expose everything." The electronic lock on the briefcase sparked suddenly, responding to Owen's agitation. He took a deep breath, steadying himself. "I know," he replied. "I just hope I'm strong enough." "You won't be alone," Tasha assured him, joining them. "We do this together." The red emergency lights pulsed through the facility's hallways, casting crimson shadows that danced across the sterile walls. Owen's footsteps echoed against the polished floor as he crept forward, his heart pounding in sync with the blaring alarms. Behind him, Stan, Mia, and Luke moved quietly, their faces tense with concentration. "We need to split up," Owen whispered, pointing down the branching corridors. "The evidence will be in the restricted sectors." Stan gripped Owen's shoulder. "Be careful, kid." The group separated, each taking a different path. Owen headed toward the control center, his fingers tingling with the familiar surge of power that allowed him to manipulate electronics. The security panels sparked and died as he passed. He had almost reached the main console when a voice cut through the darkness. "Hello, brother." Owen spun around. Marcus stood in the doorway, his trench coat casting a long shadow. The man's eyes gleamed with an unnatural light. "I'm not your brother," Owen said, backing away. Marcus laughed, the sound hollow and cold. "Aren't you? We're both products of the same assembly line, the corporation's greatest achievements." He raised his hand, and the air around him began to distort. Owen barely dodged as a wave of energy crashed into the spot where he'd been standing. The wall crumpled like paper. "You're their latest prototype," Marcus continued, advancing slowly. "But I was the first. 20 years of loyal service, whether I wanted to give it or not." Owen sent a pulse of energy toward Marcus, but the older man deflected it easily. "I won't be their puppet," Owen growled. "No one escapes their control," Marcus said, his voice almost sad. "I've tried. Others have tried. We're tools, nothing more." The fight escalated quickly. Owen threw everything he had at Marcus: temporal distortions, electrical surges, pure energy. But Marcus countered each attack with practiced ease. The facility groaned around them as their powers clashed, tearing through walls and equipment. Owen felt his control slipping as desperation set in. His powers flared wildly, ripping apart the ceiling above them. Marcus watched with knowing eyes. "You see? The more you fight, the more you prove what you are. A weapon they created." Somewhere in the distance, Owen heard Mia calling his name. Stan's voice joined hers, urgent and worried. Marcus stepped back into the shadows. We're brothers in suffering, Owen. Remember that. He vanished, leaving Owen alone in the destroyed control center. Owen staggered to his feet, his body aching from the fight. He could hear his friends approaching, their footsteps rapid against the metal floors. "Owen!" Mia burst into the room, followed by Stan and Luke. "We have to go! Security's right behind us!" Owen nodded, pushing aside the doubt that Marcus's words had planted. "This way," he said, leading them toward the exit. But even as they ran, Marcus's warning echoed in his mind, impossible to silence. The ground shook violently beneath their feet as another explosion rocked the facility. Chunks of concrete rained down from the ceiling, and emergency lights cast an eerie red glow through the smoke-filled corridors. Owen stood at the center of the chaos, his eyes blazing with determination. "You need to get out of here," he shouted to Stan, Mia, and Luke over the deafening roar of collapsing infrastructure. "I have to end this, all of it." Stan grabbed Owen's arm. "We're not leaving without you." But Owen pulled away, his hands beginning to emit a strange, pulsing energy. "They'll never stop. As long as any evidence exists, they'll keep hunting us. Hunting others like me." Mia stepped forward, tears streaming down her face. "Owen, please, there has to be another way." Around them, corporation employees fled in panic, pushing past them toward the exits. The facility's warning system blared, "Critical system failure. Evacuate immediately." Owen raised his hands and the air itself seemed to bend around him. The metal walls groaned and warped as if being pulled by an invisible force. "Go! I can't hold it much longer." Stan hesitated, then grabbed Mia and Luke by their arms. "We have to move. Now." As they ran toward the exit, Owen channeled every ounce of his power into the facility's core. The energy building within him was overwhelming, threatening to tear him apart. His vision blurred, but he maintained his focus, determined to destroy every trace of the corporation's cruel experiments. The air crackled with electricity as a swirling vortex formed above Owen. The walls began to collapse inward, drawn toward the growing singularity. Papers, equipment, and debris spiraled through the air. "Owen!" Mia's desperate cry echoed from the distance. The vortex expanded, its pull growing stronger. Owen felt his feet leave the ground as the temporal rift opened wider. Through blurred vision, he saw Stan dragging Mia and Luke to safety, their forms silhouetted against the exit. The singularity pulsed and Owen felt himself being drawn in. The facility groaned and buckled, collapsing in on itself. As consciousness slipped away, Owen smiled faintly, knowing his friends were safe. The last thing he saw was the blinding flash of the temporal rift before everything went dark. Outside, Stan, Mia, and Luke watched in horror as the facility imploded with a thunderous roar. Where the building once stood, only a smoking crater remained. The rift flickered briefly in the air above it, a shimmer of distorted space before vanishing completely. Mia fell to her knees, sobbing. Stan placed a hand on her shoulder, his own eyes wet with tears. Luke stood frozen, staring at the spot where Owen had disappeared. The silence that followed was deafening. In the quiet town of Clearview, autumn leaves scattered across the sidewalks as Stan pinned another flyer to the community board outside the local coffee shop. The bold headline read, "Remember the Children of Clearview Asylum." His hands trembled slightly as he smoothed out the paper's edges. Inside the coffee shop, Mia and Luke had transformed their usual table into a makeshift command center. Laptops, folders, and newspaper clippings covered every inch of the surface. Mia's fingers flew across her keyboard as she updated their blog, while Luke sorted through a stack of testimonies from former asylum staff members. "Another rejection," Mia sighed, pushing back from her laptop. "The Herald won't run our story, says it's too controversial." Stan joined them, pulling up a chair. "We knew this wouldn't be easy. The corporation has friends in high places." They had spent months gathering evidence, conducting interviews, and trying to piece together the stories of children who had vanished into the asylum's dark halls. Each small victory felt overshadowed by setbacks and silence from those in power. Later that afternoon, they stood before a small crowd in the town square. Stan's voice carried across the gathering as he shared what they'd learned about the corporation's experiments. Some people listened intently, while others shook their heads in disbelief and walked away. These children were real, Stan emphasized, holding up a photograph of the asylum. They had names, families, dreams. We can't let their stories be forgotten. Mia noticed the skepticism in people's faces. An elderly woman muttered something about conspiracy theories as she hurried past. Luke squeezed Mia's shoulder supportively, understanding her frustration. As Stan continued speaking, movement in the crowd caught his attention. A hooded figure stood perfectly still among the shifting audience, face hidden in shadow. There was something familiar about the way the person stood, something that made Stan's heart race. When the rally ended, the figure turned to leave. Stan called out, "Wait!" and pushed through the dispersing crowd. The figure hesitated, then began walking faster. "Please stop." Stan's voice cracked with emotion as he reached out. The hooded figure paused beneath a streetlight. Slowly, hands raised to lower the hood, revealing a face Stan thought he'd never see again. It was Owen, older, changed, but unmistakably alive. Stan stumbled forward, tears welling in his eyes as he recognized the boy he'd thought lost forever. Owen's face showed signs of age beyond his years, but his eyes held the same quiet intensity Stan remembered. The town square buzzed with energy as Owen stepped into the light. His appearance had changed. He looked older, weathered, but his eyes held a newfound confidence. Stan's breath caught in his throat as he took in the sight of the boy he thought he'd lost forever. "Owen?" Stan's voice cracked with emotion. The crowd fell silent, sensing the weight of the moment. Owen smiled, a gentle expression that carried both wisdom and weariness. "Hello, Stan." He reached into his worn jacket and pulled out a small sphere that pulsed with an ethereal blue light. "I brought something back with me, something that can help make things right." Mia and Luke pushed through the crowd to join them. Tears streamed down Mia's face as she wrapped her arms around Owen in a tight embrace. Luke stood back, shocked, but smiling. How?" Luke managed to ask. Owen held up the glowing sphere. "When I disappeared, I didn't die. I traveled through time and space, learning to control my abilities. This artifact, it can restore what was erased. All the records, all the evidence of what they did to us." The sphere hummed softly in his palm, casting dancing shadows across the gathered faces. The corporation thought they could hide their crimes by destroying the evidence, but they didn't count on someone being able to retrieve it from the past. Stan placed a steadying hand on Owen's shoulder. "What do we need to do?" "We need to take this to the old asylum records room," Owen explained. "The sphere can reconstruct the data from temporal echoes, like rewinding time for the documents themselves. But we'll face resistance. There are still people in power who don't want the truth exposed." The group moved quickly, navigating through layers of bureaucratic obstacles. Local officials tried to block their access to the records room. Police were called. But the crowd from the rally followed, bearing witness and recording everything on their phones. Inside the dusty records room, Owen held the sphere aloft. It pulsed brighter, and streams of light began to dance across the empty filing cabinets. Before their eyes, folders materialized, papers reformed, and computer drives hummed back to life. "It's working," Mia whispered, watching in awe as decades of hidden history restored itself. The recovered documents revealed everything: lists of victims, experiment protocols, financial records linking powerful figures to the program. As news spread through social media and independent journalists, public outrage grew into a thundering chorus demanding justice. Within weeks, congressional hearings were announced. Similar facilities across the country were investigated and shut down. Families torn apart by the program finally learned the fate of their loved ones. New legislation was drafted to prevent such abuses from ever happening again. If you enjoyed the story of Owen, I handpicked this next story that you will enjoy. Please don't miss this one. Click here to watch it.